My professor didn't know I'd just sold my startup for 7 figures when he said, "You'll struggle to find work with grades like these." He said it during office hours, in front of 2 other students, with the specific confidence of a man who had never once been wrong in his own mind. Professor Aldous Crane, tenured since 2003, author of a textbook that his own department required students to purchase, chair of the Undergraduate Entrepreneurship Advisory Committee, which is a title that should have been the first warning sign, but which I had, in my 23 years on Earth, not yet learned to read correctly. He was looking at my transcript on his monitor when he said it, and he said it in the tone of someone delivering a kindness, a hard truth wrapped in concern, the kind of sentence that sounds like it's for your benefit, but lands in your sternum like a thumbtack. I had my phone in my jacket pocket. The wire transfer confirmation had arrived at 9:47 that morning. $2.3 million, net of fees, for my 62% stake in a B2B logistics software company I'd built in a rented garage while taking 16 credit hours and sleeping 5 hours a night for the better part of 2 years. I sat across from Professor Crane in the chair that faced his desk, the one with the slightly uneven leg that rocked if you shifted your weight, and I looked at his screen and saw my GPA, 2.71, and I thought about saying nothing. I almost did. Then I thought about the 2 years. I had been enrolled in the business program at the University of Cincinnati for 3 years when the office hours conversation happened, and I want to give you the full context because the GPA needs context or it becomes the whole story, and the GPA was never the whole story. I'd started college the conventional way. Full course load, residence hall, the social architecture of freshman year that everyone tells you is formative and that I found mostly exhausting. I was good at the parts of school that required building things and bad at the parts that required sitting still and absorbing other people's frameworks. My quantitative scores were strong. My attendance in lecture-heavy courses was not. I'd taken a leave of absence in my second year to work on the company full-time, which had cost me a semester of continuous enrollment and required a complicated return-to-good standing process that had left marks on my record that Professor Crane was now interpreting as evidence of a fundamental deficit. The company was called RouteFlow. It built optimization software for last-mile delivery logistics, the specific, unglamorous problem of how to route a fleet of 20 delivery vehicles through a mid-sized city in real time when 4 things change every 30 minutes. It was not glamorous. It was not consumer-facing. Nobody was going to write a TechCrunch piece about last-mile delivery software. But every regional grocer, every pharmacy chain, every furniture company with their own fleet had this problem, and nobody had solved it elegantly for the sub-enterprise market. And I had an algorithm that did, and I had spent 22 months turning that algorithm into a product that companies would pay for on a SaaS model. And by the time I was sitting in Professor Crane's office, 41 companies were paying for it. The acquisition had been approached by a logistics conglomerate called Veridian Group, which operated in 14 countries and had been building their own version of the problem RouteFlow had already solved, and had concluded, after 18 months of internal development, that buying was cheaper than building. My attorney, a transactional lawyer named Obi Daramola, who'd been doing M&A for 26 years, and who had the specific quality of someone who'd seen every possible way a deal could go wrong, and had therefore become almost cosmically unflappable, had negotiated the purchase agreement over 4 months while I continued attending classes and pretending to be a normal college junior. The wire had cleared that morning. My co-founder, a computer science senior named Petra Volkov, who held the other 38%, had texted me at 9:51 with a single message. It's real. I had replied with a thumbs up because neither of us had language for it yet. Then I had gone to office hours because I had a paper due, and Professor Crane had emailed me that my draft needed significant revision, and I had decided to hear what he had to say before deciding what to do about it. The first time Professor Crane had made an impression on me that I'd filed away was in the first week of his entrepreneurship seminar, which was a required course for the business program, and which I had been genuinely looking forward to, the way you look forward to a thing that should be in your wheelhouse. He had asked the class to describe a business idea and explain the market opportunity, which is a standard first-day exercise, and I had described RouteFlow in broad strokes: the logistics optimization problem, the target market, the SaaS model. He had said, "That's a niche market with high technical barriers. What's your technical background?" I'd said I was a business major with some self-taught programming experience. He'd said, and moved on to the next student. The HM contained a complete assessment. I had told myself it was nothing. The second moment came 6 weeks later, when I turned in a business plan assignment that was, in structural honesty, not a theoretical exercise, but a lightly fictionalized version of RouteFlow's actual plan, with the actual unit economics and the actual customer acquisition numbers changed to obscure the fact that it was real. He had graded it a C+ and written in the margin, "Revenue projections are unrealistic for a market at this maturity level, and the technical feasibility section lacks credibility." The technical feasibility section described, in abstracted form, software I had already built and was already running in production. I had stared at that C+ for a long time. Then I had gone back to building. The third moment was a case study discussion about a company that had attempted exactly what RouteFlow was doing, had failed, and had been used by Professor Crane as an example of the dangers of entering technically complex markets without sufficient capital. He had described the failure with the satisfaction of someone whose existing beliefs have been confirmed by data. I had raised my hand and said that the company in question had failed for reasons unrelated to the technical complexity. They'd had a go-to-market problem, not a product problem, and their target segment had been too broad, and there were companies in the space that had solved the technical problem and were generating revenue. Professor Crane had said, "Can you name one?" I had said yes, and had named a company I was aware of from competitor research. He had said, "That company isn't publicly traded and has no verifiable revenue, so citing it doesn't actually support your argument." I had sat down and said nothing else because I had also been unable to name my own company without revealing things I wasn't ready to reveal, and the room had moved on, and Professor Crane had looked satisfied in the specific way of people who have just won an argument by disqualifying the evidence. The first professional I'd brought fully into the root flow picture, beyond Petra and my parents, was Obi Daramola, who I'd found through a referral from a Cincinnati-based angel investor named Kweku Asante, who had given Rootflow its first $80,000 in exchange for 8% equity, which Viridian had bought out along with my and Petra's shares. Kweku was 54, had started and sold 3 companies before becoming an investor, and had the quality of someone who moved slowly and thought fast, which I learned to read as a sign of high competence. He had looked at the product, talked to 3 of our customers, reviewed the unit economics, and said, "I'm in, within 2 weeks." He had also said something that I thought about during every subsequent conversation with Professor Crane. The people who tell you your market is too niche are usually the people who don't understand your customers. Obi had come recommended specifically for technology M&A and had spent the 4 months of the Viridian negotiation disassembling every term in the purchase agreement and reconstructing it in our favor, including an earnout provision that Viridian's initial draft had structured in a way that Obi said was designed to pay us less than the headline number by attaching milestone conditions that were technically achievable but practically difficult. He had rewritten the earnout structure over 3 rounds of negotiation and had ultimately argued for and received a higher upfront payment that reduced the earnout component, which meant the wire that cleared that morning was cleaner and larger than Viridian's first offer had implied. I owed Obi a significant portion of the outcome and had told him so, and he had said, "You built something worth buying. I just made sure you got paid for it correctly." The due diligence process had involved a third professional I want to describe accurately, a financial analyst at Viridian's M&A team named Constance Abernethy, who was in her late 30s and who had the specific manner of someone whose job was to find problems in the thing you'd built and present them to her principals in a way that justified a price reduction. She had gone through Routeflow's financials, customer contracts, technical architecture documentation, and churn metrics over 6 weeks, and I had answered every question she sent and provided every document she requested. And at the end of the process, she had said, in a call with Obi and me, that the business was cleaner than most they evaluated at this stage, and that the technical documentation in particular was unusually thorough. I had not mentioned that I had prepared most of that documentation while sitting in the back of a 3-credit lecture on corporate finance that I was technically attending and therefore theoretically improving my GPA. The irony was not lost on me. The crisis that nearly ended the deal came in the 3rd month of due diligence, when Viridian's legal team found a contract with one of our early customers that had a clause Obi described as problematic, a perpetual license provision that a customer had insisted on as a condition of signing, which I had agreed to early in the company's life when I had been less sophisticated about contract terms and desperately needed the revenue validation. Viridian's position was that the perpetual license clause created an encumbrance on the IP that complicated the clean transfer they needed for the acquisition. Their initial response was to request a price reduction of $340,000 to offset what they described as the cost of renegotiating or buying out the problematic contract. Obi's response was to spend 10 days analyzing the contract, the customer relationship, and the legal precedent on perpetual license provisions in SaaS acquisitions, and then to present a counterargument that the clause was narrower than Viridian's team had characterized, and that the affected customer had a 60-day termination right that could be exercised post-acquisition, which reduced the practical risk substantially. I had spent those 10 days in a state of physical alertness that I can only describe as sustained low-grade dread, not panic, but the persistent awareness that the thing I'd spent 2 years building was in a room with people who were being paid to find reasons to pay less for it, and that the outcome depended on Obi's legal analysis and my own documentation being stronger than their objections. Obi's counter-argument was accepted with a compromise, a $75,000 escrow holdback contingent on the customer contract situation being resolved within 90 days, which it was. The final net number was $2.3 million for my stake. I had made a note to go back and add a section on contract negotiation to the Routeflow documentation I'd been building for months, partly for my own reference and partly because I intended at some point to tell this story accurately and completely to people who were earlier in the process than I'd been. Professor Crane said, "You'll struggle to find work with grades like these," at approximately 10:20 a.m. on a Thursday in November, in an office that smelled like printed paper and the particular indoor quality of a room where someone had been drinking tea for 20 years. He said it looking at his monitor, not at me. The two students who'd been waiting their turn in the outer office were partially visible through the glass panel beside his door, which had been left open. I thought about the wire transfer confirmation. I thought about Obi's voice on the phone that morning when he'd called to confirm the transfer had cleared. "That's it," he'd said. "That's done." I thought about 2 years of 5-hour nights and the C+ on the business plan and the HM after my first pitch in the seminar. And I thought about Constance Abernethy saying the technical documentation was unusually thorough. Then I said, "I actually wanted to tell you something, Professor, since you're looking at my record. I have some context that might be relevant." He looked up from the monitor, which was the first time he'd made eye contact in the conversation. I said, "I sold my company this morning." He said, "I'm sorry?" I said, "Rootflow. It's a logistics software company I've been running for the past 2 years. Viridian Group acquired it. The wire transferred this morning, a little before 10. He looked at me for a moment without saying anything, which was the most genuine thing I'd seen from him. I said, "I know the GPA is low. I was running the company while finishing the degree, and I made trade-offs. I don't regret them." He said, "How much?" I said, "Enough that the grades are going to be fine." He said, "I didn't know you had a company." I said, "I know." That was the end of the conversation that mattered. What happened afterward was slower and stranger than a movie version of this story would allow. Professor Crane did not immediately become a different person, or publicly reverse his assessment or experience a visible transformation. He said, "Congratulations, that's significant," and he seemed to mean it. And I left his office and walked across campus in the November cold and sat on a bench and called my mother, who cried in the way she sometimes did when relief arrived after a long period of sustained worry. She had known about the deal, and had known about the closing timeline, and had spent 4 months not saying anything to anyone, which is a form of love I've spent a lot of time thinking about since. I called Petra, who was in a Thursday afternoon lab, and she didn't answer, and I left a voicemail that said, "It's done." I told one person, "Call me." Then I sat on the bench for a while longer and thought about the next part, which was finishing the degree, which I still intended to do. The paper Professor Crane had said needed significant revision was a 20-page analysis of a market entry strategy for a hypothetical company entering the logistics software space, which I had written without disclosing that I had more empirical knowledge of the logistics software space than most people in the building. After the office hours conversation, I went back to my apartment and rewrote the paper's market analysis section from scratch, this time without the constraint of pretending the knowledge was hypothetical. I described the actual competitive dynamics, the actual pricing sensitivity of the target customer segment, the actual technical barriers to entry. I didn't identify Routeflow by name. I didn't have to. The analysis was specific and grounded in a way that theoretical frameworks cannot produce, and when Professor Crane returned it 3 weeks later, he had written at the top, in his precise red pen hand, "This is the strongest market analysis I've received from an undergraduate in several years. What changed?" I wrote back in the margin. I stopped pretending I didn't know what I was talking about. He gave it an A-, which raised my GPA in his class and did not change my overall transcript in any meaningful way, and I filed the paper in the same folder where I kept the C+ business plan, not out of resentment, but because I wanted to have both documents in the same place for reasons I was still working out. Kweku Asante heard about the office hours exchange through me over dinner a month after the closing, and he told me something I've thought about many times since. The function of gatekeepers like Crane isn't to identify talent. It's to identify the kind of talent that resembles their existing model of what talent looks like. If you don't fit the model, the gate doesn't open. But the gate was never the only way in. That's not a critique of education, he said. It's just a description of how institutions work. You have to decide whether you're going to spend your energy fitting the model or building the evidence that the model is incomplete. I said I'd been doing both simultaneously, which was why my GPA was a 2.71 and my bank account had recently become something I hadn't fully absorbed yet. He laughed and said, "That's a reasonable allocation of resources." I said, "I'm going back to finish." He said, "I know. That's the right call. The credential matters less than the habit of completing things you started." I graduated the following May, a semester late due to the leave of absence, with a final GPA of 2.84 that I did not try to raise through grade appeals or professor lobbying because it reflected an accurate accounting of the trade-offs I had made, and I was not interested in retroactively pretending otherwise. Professor Crane attended the department's graduation reception, and I shook his hand, and he said, genuinely and without apparent awkwardness, that he was glad I'd finished and that he hoped I'd write about what I'd built. I said I was planning to. I meant it. I was planning an essay about last-mile logistics software, specifically structured for founders working in non-consumer markets who had been told their customer segment was too niche to build for. I was going to publish it, with Kweku's encouragement, on a platform where people like Professor Crane's future students might find it before they'd been fully convinced that the GPA was the measure of the thing. Obi Daramola came to the graduation party my parents threw at their house and gave a toast that was mostly about contract negotiation, and that was also, in its way, about something larger, about the difference between the documented value of a thing and its actual value, and about how the gap between those two numbers is where most of the interesting work happens. Petra was there too, finishing her computer science degree that same semester, having agreed to stay on with Viridian in a technical lead role for 18 months under the acquisition terms, which suited her better than it would have suited me. She had the quality of someone who was happiest when the problem in front of her was defined well enough to solve, and Viridian had problems that were defined well enough and large enough to keep her interested for a while. We had built something together and sold it together, and were now doing different things with the proceeds and with the knowledge that remained, which is a better outcome than most co-founder relationships reach. Professor Crane's seminar continued to use a textbook he'd co-authored, which contained a case study section that cited 3 companies as examples of successful navigation of technically complex market entry. In the semester after my graduation, a former classmate who was still in the program texted me to say that RootFlow had been added to the case study list. Not the textbook, those updates took years, but the supplementary reading list that Professor Crane distributed at the start of each semester. A 1-page description of the company, the market problem, and the acquisition outcome, sourced from the TechCrunch piece that had eventually been written about the deal after all, by a journalist who'd been covering logistics technology and who'd found the story through a filing in the M&A record. The piece had been accurate and specific and had described me as a self-taught founder who had built the company while completing a business degree, which was true, and had not mentioned the GPA, which I was grateful for, because the GPA was not the story. He said I'd struggle to find work. What he meant was that he couldn't see a path from where I was standing to somewhere worth going. He was looking at the transcript, and I was sitting on a wire transfer confirmation. We were looking at the same person through completely different instruments, and his instrument wasn't wrong exactly. A 2.71 GPA is a 2.71 GPA. It just wasn't measuring the thing that turned out to matter. I don't carry resentment about that. I carry the 2 years.